Title: Under the Moonlight. It was an autumn night, and the air was charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Clara walked along the cobblestone streets of the historic center, wrapped in a coat that barely protected her from the cold. Her thoughts were distant, as they always were since he had entered her life. He, Lucas. A man who seemed to have stepped out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on the day. They met at a charity event, where he was the mysterious host and she, a common guest. Lucas was tall, with deep eyes and a smile that seemed to hide secrets. From the first glance, Clara felt something she had never experienced before. An attraction that went beyond the physical, something that made her question everything she knew about herself. That night, he invited her to dinner at his apartment, a place that looked more like a museum than a home. The walls were adorned with original works of art, and the marble floor reflected the soft candlelight. He greeted her with a look that made her feel naked, even though she was dressed. "You're different," he said, pouring her a glass of red wine. "Different from all the others." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew he wasn't just talking about her appearance. There was something about Lucas that challenged her, that made her want to explore parts of herself she didn't even know existed. They talked for hours, about art, music, philosophy. Each of his words was like a thread weaving a web around her, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to escape. When he finally stood up and held out his hand to her, Clara felt she was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. "Trust me," he whispered, and she followed him. The room was lit only by the moonlight streaming through the large windows. He led her to the bed, where he laid her down with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. Every touch of his was calculated, as if he knew exactly how to make her feel alive. Clara closed her eyes, surrendering to that feeling of freedom and vulnerability. That night, she discovered that lover, whatever it was, could be both sweet and dangerous. And Lucas was the personification of that duality. Chapter 2: The Power Game. In the days following that night, Clara found herself in a whirlwind of emotions. Lucas was unlike any man she had ever met. He was intense, unpredictable, and every encounter with him was like an emotional roller coaster. He took her to places she had never imagined, going private art galleries, dinners at exclusive restaurants, and even a helicopter flight over the city at sunset. But it was in the moments alone that the true magic happened. Lucas had a way of looking at her that made her heart race. He challenged her, provoked her, and at the same time made her feel incredibly safe. It was as if he knew every part of her, even though she hadn't yet discovered herself. One night, he took her to an old abandoned theater. The place was silent, except for the sound of their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. He guided her to the stage, where a single light illuminated them. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with an intensity that made her tremble. Clara hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. He smiled, that smile she knew so well, and began to dance with her. There was no music, only the sound of their breathing and the beating of their heart. Each movement was slow, calculated, as if they were exploring uncharted territory. "You're incredible," he whispered in her ear, and she felt a shiver run through her body. At that moment, Clara realized she was completely in love with him. But she also knew that Lucas was a man of many secrets, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to discover them. Chapter 3: Lucas's Secret. As the days passed, Clara began to notice strange things. Lucas received calls late at night, and whenever she asked, he changed the subject. He had moments of distance, as if he were in another world, and this made her insecure. One afternoon, while he was at work, she decided to explore his apartment. That's when she found a locked door at the end of the hallway. Curiosity consumed her, and she tried to open it, but couldn't. When Lucas came home, she confronted him about the door. "What's behind that door?" she asked, trying to remain calm. He looked at her for a moment, as if deciding what to say. Then, finally, he replied, "There are things in my life that I'm not ready to share yet, but I promise you, when the time is right, you'll know everything." Clara didn't know what to think. She wanted to trust him, but she also felt there was something more, something he was hiding, and that scared her. Chapter 4. The Choice. The tension between them grew with each passing day. Clara knew she needed to make a decision: stay with Lucas, despite the secrets, or move on and try to forget him. But how could she forget someone who had touched her soul in a way no one else ever had? One night, he took her to a lighthouse by the sea. The wind was blowing strongly, and the waves crashed against the rocks below. He hugged her from behind, and she felt the warmth of his body against hers. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered, and she felt tears run down her face. "Then show me who you really are," she replied, her voice trembling. He turned her to face him, and for the first time, she saw vulnerability in his eyes. He was fighting against something he couldn't control. "I love you, Clara," he said, and she felt her heart stop. "But I don't know if I'm good for you." She looked at him, feeling a mixture of fear and hope. She knew that whatever her decision, nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 5. The Revelation. Clara spent a sleepless night, tossing and turning in bed as Lucas's words echoed in her mind. "I love you, Clara, but I don't know if I'm good for you." What did he mean by that? What were the secrets he was hiding so much? She knew she couldn't continue like this, living in the shadow of her doubts. The next day, she decided to confront him again. This time, there would be no excuses or changing the subject. She needed answers. Lucas received her in his apartment, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. He knew she was there to talk about the locked door, about the secrets he kept. "Lucas, I need to know the truth," she said, her voice firm but full of emotion. "What's behind that door? What are you hiding from me?" He looked at her for a moment, his dark eyes reflecting an internal struggle. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice soft but filled with a seriousness that made her tremble. "But you need to promise you won't run away. What I'm about to show you could change everything." He led her to the locked door at the end of the hallway. With a key he took from his pocket, he unlocked the door and slowly opened it. Clara felt her heart race as he guided her inside. What she saw left her speechless. The room was a kind of sanctuary, filled with photographs, documents, and maps. There was a table in the center, covered with papers and a laptop. Lucas was much more than she imagined. "I work for an organization," he began, his voice calm but filled with an intensity that made her feel dizzy. We help people who are in danger, who have nowhere to go. But what we do isn't exactly legal." Clara looked at him, trying to process what he was saying. Was he some kind of agent? A vigilante? She didn't know what to think. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I didn't want to put you in danger," he replied, his eyes filled with a sincerity that made her feel even more confused. "But I can't hide it from you anymore. I love you, Clara, and I need you to know the truth." Chapter 6. The Decision. Clara spent the next few days in a whirlwind of emotions. She knew she loved Lucas, but she also knew that his life was much more complicated than she had ever imagined. She wasn't sure if she was ready to deal with all of it. One night, he took her to a park by the lake. The moon reflected on the water, creating an almost magical setting. He hugged her from behind, and she felt the warmth of his body against hers. "I know this is a lot for you," he whispered in her ear, "and I understand if you want to leave. But I need you to know that I'll do anything to protect you." Clara looked at him, feeling a mixture of fear and hope. She knew that whatever her decision, nothing would ever be the same. "I love you, Lucas," she said, her voice trembling. "And I'm not going to run away, but you need to promise you won't hide anything from me anymore." He looked at her for a moment, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her feel alive. Then, finally, he nodded. "I promise," he said, and she felt a weight lifted from her shoulders. Chapter 7. The Future. In the months that followed, Clara and Lucas began to rebuild their relationship on a new foundation of trust and transparency. He introduced her to his team, and she began to better understand the work he did. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also incredibly important. She learned to cope with the tense moments, the nights he went out on missions and she stayed home, waiting for news. But there were also moments of pure happiness, like when he took her to surprise dinners or when they simply stayed home, watching movies and laughing together. Clara knew her life with Lucas would never be easy, but she also knew it was worth it. He was the love of her life, and she would do anything to stay by his side. One night, while they were sitting on the terrace of their apartment, looking at the city lights, Lucas looked at her with a smile that made her feel completely loved. "Thank you for never giving up on me," he said, his voice filled with a gratitude that made her incredibly happy. "I love you, Lucas," she replied, feeling completely at home. And so, they began a new life together, filled with love, adventure, and the promise of a bright future.